He wants to suggest, rather, that there is a good, a pure, a better capitalism. He imagines it existed in the past, and so what we have, while it's very bad, isn't really to be blamed on capitalism, because if we really had capitalism, you see, we wouldn't have these problems. Well, let me respond. What I taught most of my life as a professor of economics was something we call economic history. That is, we always thought it was important for students to understand economics in a historical way, to study how, for example, the system we have now, capitalism, how it evolved, how it began, how it changed across the centuries that it has existed to be what it is today. That studying history was a very useful way to understanding the present. It is something all people interested in history understand. My study of the history of capitalism, which I taught for decades here in the United States in the various universities where I was a teacher, if it taught me anything, taught me the following. Throughout the history of capitalism, every capitalist who could tried to become a monopolist, tried to get around competition, tried to do better than the other fellow, which is what we call competition. And when he did, he put the other fellow out of business. And when the other fellow went out of business, you know who bought the machines he couldn't afford to keep running anymore? The guy who beat him. And you know who hired his workers when he laid them off because he wasn't competitive enough? The guy who beat him. And when the guy who beat him bought his machines and hired his workers, the guy who beat him was left without a competitor. And that was a very attractive objective. And it was something a capitalist strove to do because of being afraid that if he didn't, somebody else in the business would do it to him. In other words, competition is a high-pressure game that drives every capitalist to a behavior that eliminates competition. That story has been repeated over and over again. Once upon a time, we had 50 automobile companies. Now we have a handful. Once upon a time, we had dozens of cigarette companies. Now we have a handful. Once upon a time, fill in the blank. It is the history of every industry. And by the way, the history goes both ways. Sometimes when you have just a few companies, that very monopoly or oligopoly, as it's sometimes called, provokes new competition to enter. In other words, the rise and fall of a competition, the rise and fall of competitiveness is part of how capitalism works. Likewise, a free market. What in the world does that mean? You mean a market in which the government doesn't intervene? We've never had such a market. Never, ever, anywhere. That's a fantasy, something that might be useful as a teaching device to give you an idea of how all the interventions that have always been part of capitalism work. But to actually take it seriously, we could have a free market. That's somebody who has never studied economic history, because like a purely competitive capitalism or a free market capitalism, it is a teaching device not to be confused with an actuality. Therefore, the capitalism we have is the capitalism we've always had. Sometimes it has a bit more competitiveness, sometimes less. Sometimes one industry is a bit more competitive and another one is less. That's how it works.